Bury him before the quarter ends. He said it in the hallway outside my room, thinking the door was shut all the way, thinking an old man in hospice care wouldn't have anybody in his corner who'd actually hear it and understand what it meant. Just get him comfortable, not aggressive. If we can get him to expire before the quarter ends, that's one less liability on the books. My hospice aide was refilling a water pitcher 3 feet away, and she heard every single word. I'm 73 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about dying, though I am, in fact, dying. It's a story about what a company will quietly do to a man's remaining months when his continued survival costs them money on a balance sheet, and what a stranger with no stake in any of it is willing to do about it once she understands what's actually happening in the room she walks into every single day. I live outside Akron, Ohio, in a small house I bought 41 years ago with a settlement check that came at the cost of my left leg below the knee and 3 months in a burn unit. I worked the furnace floor at Corrigan Steel starting when I was 22 years old, and at 32, a pressure valve failure sent molten slag across half the floor in under 4 seconds, catching me before I could clear the walkway. 2 men died that day. I lived, though it took the leg, most of the feeling in my left hand, and the better part of 2 years to relearn how to walk, work, and sleep through a night without waking up somewhere back inside that furnace room. I remember that day with a clarity that 4 decades hasn't managed to soften. The particular sound the valve made just before it failed, a groan I'd heard 100 times before that never once preceded anything worse than a maintenance ticket. And then the heat, faster and more total than anything I'd ever imagined a body could survive. I remember Danny Wojcik, working the station beside mine, and Earl Prater, cleaning a runoff channel 20 feet further down the line. And I remember, even through my own pain in the weeks that followed, understanding that whatever I'd lost considerably less than either of them had. The 2 years of recovery that followed tested every piece of who I understood myself to be. I learned to walk again on a prosthesis that, in 1984, offered nowhere near the sophistication modern devices provide. Learned to work with a left hand that never fully recovered its grip strength. Learned, slowly and with a great deal of frustration, that the man I'd been before that valve failed wasn't entirely the same man who eventually walked out of that rehabilitation facility. I sued Corrigan Steel, not out of any particular vindictiveness, but because the medical bills alone would have bankrupted me twice over without it, and because a lawyer I met through a support group for burn survivors convinced me I had a legitimate claim worth pursuing. The settlement itself took nearly 3 years to finalize, Corrigan Steel's insurers fighting every piece of it, and I remember the exhaustion of that legal battle almost as vividly as I remember the accident itself. Deposition after deposition, medical examiners hired by the other side who seemed determined to minimize what I'd actually lost. When the settlement finally came through, structured as a lifetime monthly payment rather than a lump sum, my attorney at the time explained it was actually the better outcome for a man my age. Guaranteed income for the rest of my life rather than a sum that could be mismanaged or exhausted decades before I actually needed it. Corrigan Steel folded 11 years after my accident. The liability from my lawsuit, along with several others from that same era, transferred to an insurance company called Highland Assurance Group, which took over the structured settlement payments I'd been awarded, $840 a month for the remainder of my life, a figure that felt substantial in 1984 and has felt considerably less substantial every year since, though it's remained for 4 decades. One of the few things in my life I could count on arriving reliably the 15th of every month without fail. Welcome to Brian's revenge. If that opening's already sitting heavy in your chest, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button. Tell me where you're watching from and stay with me. Because what happened over these last several months is going to show you exactly how far a company will go to make an old man's remaining time on this earth into a line item they'd prefer to close out early. I never married, no children, spent my working years after the accident doing what disability and a modified body allowed. Small engine repair mostly. Running a little shop out of my garage that let me set my own hours around the pain that never fully went away. There was a woman, once in my 40s, a relationship that lasted the better part of 4 years before she decided, gently but firmly, that she wanted a different kind of life than the quiet, limited existence my body and my history had shaped for me. I don't blame her for that decision, not really, though I've thought about her more often, these past several months, than I have in years, wondering what my life might have looked like if I'd been a different, easier kind of man to build a future around. I've been mostly alone these last several years. A few old friends from the plant who check in occasionally, a niece in Cleveland who calls on holidays, the ordinary quiet solitude of a man who never built the kind of family that fills a house on weekends. If you've made it this far, I want you to hold onto that detail about being alone, because it matters for understanding exactly how much it meant when somebody who owed me absolutely nothing decided to show up. I was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma 8 months ago, advanced enough by the time it was caught that my oncologist, a careful, thorough woman named Dr. Amara Osai, told me plainly that we were looking at months rather than years, though she believed a newer treatment protocol, still fairly experimental but showing real promise in trials, might meaningfully extend that timeline if we moved on it quickly. I remember that diagnosis appointment with a clarity that mirrors, in an odd way, my memory of the furnace accident 4 decades earlier, the same sense of a life splitting cleanly into before and after in the space of a single conversation. Doctor. Osai was gentle but direct, laid out my prognosis without softening it more than honesty allowed, and I remember driving myself home afterward, alone, understanding, with a strange calm that surprised me, that I'd already survived one version of my own mortality once before, at 32, in a furnace room that should have killed me, and that whatever came next, I intended to face it with the same stubborn refusal to simply accept the easiest, quietest outcome. I called my niece in Cleveland that same evening, told her the diagnosis plainly, and I remember the particular ache of hearing her voice catch on the other end of the line, 3 hours away, unable to do much beyond offer the kind of long-distance support that phone calls and occasional visits allow. She offered to come stay with me, an offer I gently declined at the time, not wanting to disrupt her own family's life for a diagnosis I still didn't fully understand the shape. I entered hospice care 4 months ago, not because I'd given up on treatment entirely, but because the hospice facility, Willowbrook Care Center, offered the kind of comprehensive support that let me pursue Dr. Osai's recommended protocol, while also managing the pain and exhaustion that had become near-constant companions by that point. I remember the day I decided on Willowbrook clearly, sitting with Dr. Osai in her office, going over the various options available to me, understanding that hospice care in this stage of my life wasn't necessarily a surrender, the way I'd always imagined it growing up, watching relatives enter facilities that felt like waiting rooms for death rather than places actively supporting whatever fight remained. Dr. Osai was careful to explain that modern hospice philosophy, done well, could actually support aggressive treatment alongside comfort care, that the two weren't mutually exclusive the way older generations sometimes assumed. I chose Willowbrook specifically because of that philosophy, because their intake materials had emphasized exactly the kind of integrated approach Dr. Osai described, and I remember feeling, walking into that facility for the first time, a cautious hope that I might actually get both things I needed most: comfort for the pain and a real fighting chance at whatever additional time modern medicine could offer somebody in my position. That's where I met Carmen Reyes, my primary hospice aide, 26 years old, 3 years into a career she'd chosen. She told me once, because her own grandmother had spent her final months in a facility where nobody seemed to actually see the person underneath the diagnosis. And Carmen had decided, watching that she wanted to be the kind of person who saw people clearly, right up until the very end. Carmen came into my care during my second week at Willowbrook, assigned to my room as part of her regular rotation, and I noticed, almost immediately, a quality of attention in her that felt different from the perfectly competent but understandably businesslike care most of the staff provided. She asked me questions about my actual life, not just my symptoms, wanted to know about the furnace floor at Corrigan Steel, about the little engine repair shop I'd run out of my garage for 3 decades, about whether I had any family she should be looping in on updates. I told her the truth, that there wasn't much family to loop in, that my niece in Cleveland called on holidays, and that was mostly the extent of it. Carmen didn't say much in response that first week, but I noticed, over the following days, that she started staying a few extra minutes past what her round strictly required, sitting with me sometimes while I worked through a crossword puzzle, asking about the furnace accident with a genuine curiosity that made the telling of it feel less like reciting a tragedy and more like sharing a piece of my actual history with somebody who cared to hold it. I remember one particular afternoon, maybe 3 weeks into my stay, when Carmen brought in an old photograph she'd found online of the Corrigan Steel plant, long since demolished, said she'd gotten curious after our conversations and wanted to see what the place had actually looked like. We spent the better part of an hour that afternoon with that photograph between us, me pointing out where the furnace floor had been, where my station used to sit, telling her stories about Danny Wojcik and Earl Prater that I hadn't told anybody in years, not because I'd been trying to keep them private, but because nobody had asked in a long while. She told me, in turn, about her own grandmother, a woman named Rosa who'd raised Carmen for much of her childhood, while her own parents worked long hours to keep the family afloat, and about the particular grief of watching that same grandmother spend her final 8 months in a facility where the staff, however competent, had never once asked her a single question about the life she'd lived before arriving there. I decided, right around then, Carmen told me, that if I was going to do this work, I wanted to actually know the people I was caring for, not just manage their charts. There was an evening, maybe 6 weeks into my stay, when my pain had flared badly enough that sleep felt impossible, and Carmen, near the end of her shift, pulled a chair up beside my bed instead of clocking out, stayed with me nearly an hour past when her responsibilities technically ended, talking quietly about nothing important and everything important in equal measure, the particular kind of conversation that makes 3 in the morning feel less endless than it otherwise would. I asked her that same evening why she'd taken this particular interest in an old man with no real family to speak of, why she kept staying those extra minutes when her actual job would have been perfectly well done without them. She thought about it a long moment before answering. "Mr. Ashby, everybody in this building is somebody's whole world, or should be, even the ones who don't have a crowd of visitors showing up every week." I decided a long time ago that if I was going to spend my career in rooms like this one, I wasn't going to let anybody's final months feel like they didn't matter just because nobody else was in the room to witness them. I didn't have much of an answer for that, my throat tight in a way I hadn't expected. I just nodded, understanding more fully with each passing week exactly what kind of person had ended up, entirely by chance of a rotation assignment, caring for me during what everybody involved understood might be the last significant stretch of my life. Welcome back to Brian's Revenge if you're just joining us. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what Carmen overheard in that hallway and what she did about it afterward is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story instead of it having already quietly ended the way somebody clearly hoped it would. A representative from Highland Assurance Group, a regional claims director named Dennis Corbett, had been assigned to review my case roughly 3 months into my hospice stay, standard practice. I was told, for claimants whose structured settlements involved payments contingent on continued survival, a periodic check-in to confirm my status and update the file. I'd met him once before, briefly, a polished man in his 40s with the particular smooth effect of someone whose job requires him to sound sympathetic without actually feeling much of anything underneath it. I remember that first meeting with Dennis, a few weeks into my hospice stay, how carefully he'd asked about my comfort, my care team, whether Willowbrook was meeting my needs, all the surface-level courtesy of a man performing concern rather than feeling it. He'd asked, near the end of that first visit, a question that felt innocuous at the time, but that I've thought about often since, whether I'd discussed a timeline with my medical team, phrased casually, almost conversationally, though I understand now exactly what kind of information he was actually gathering. It was during his second visit, a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before the end of the fiscal quarter, that Carmen overheard the conversation that changed everything about how I understood my own situation. If this story's got a knot forming in your stomach already, that's exactly where I need you to be. Because what Carmen did with what she heard that afternoon is the reason this story exists at all. She told me about it that same evening, waiting until my dinner tray had been cleared and we had a quiet stretch before the night shift took over. And I could see, in the careful way she was choosing her words, that she'd spent the whole afternoon working up the nerve to tell me at all. "Mr. Ashby," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't fully know how to say it gently, so I'm just going to say it plainly. I was refilling your water pitcher this afternoon when that man from the insurance company was on the phone in the hallway. He didn't know I could hear him. He said, and I'm quoting as close as I can remember it, just get him comfortable, not aggressive. If we can get him to expire before the quarter ends, that's one less liability on the books." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it, hearing it secondhand from a 26-year-old hospice aide who'd clearly debated for hours whether telling me was the right thing to do. 41 years of monthly payments, a settlement that had cost me a leg and years of pain to earn, and a man discussing my continued survival like an unwelcome expense that needed closing out before it dragged down somebody's quarterly numbers. "Are you certain that's what he said, Carmen?" I asked her, my voice not entirely steady. "I'm certain, Mr. Ashby. I wrote it down as soon as I got to the supply closet, word for word, while it was still fresh. I wasn't going to say anything at first because I wasn't sure it was my place. But then I started paying closer attention to your care plan, and Mr. Ashby, something about it doesn't sit right with me." "What do you mean?" I asked, "Doctor." "OSI recommended that experimental treatment protocol for you, right? The one that's shown real promise in extending survival for cases like yours. I've been reading your chart carefully these past few weeks, and the hospice team's care coordinator keeps steering you toward comfort-only palliative options instead, discouraging the more aggressive treatment path even though Dr. Osai's notes clearly recommend pursuing it. I don't think that's a coincidence anymore. Not after what I heard in that hallway. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I want you to understand, if you're still with me, subscribe if you haven't already, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what Carmen did over the following weeks, entirely outside anything her job required of her, unpaid overtime and genuine personal risk to her own position at Willowbrook, is the reason I'm still here to tell you any of this. I called Dr. Osai myself the following morning, told her what Carmen had overheard, and asked her directly whether she'd noticed any resistance to her recommended treatment protocol coming from the hospice care coordination team. She was quiet a long moment before answering, and I could hear, in that silence, the particular carefulness of a physician choosing her words around something she'd apparently already been uneasy about herself. Mr. Ashby, I have noticed some pushback, yes, framed as concerns about your quality of life and the burden of aggressive treatment given your prognosis. I assumed it was standard hospice philosophy, prioritizing comfort over aggressive intervention. I didn't have any reason to suspect it was connected to anything financial. But now that you're telling me this, I want you to know that treatment protocol genuinely could extend your timeline meaningfully, possibly by a year or more, and I've been troubled by how much friction I've encountered trying to get it authorized through your case coordination. I sat with that call a long while after it ended, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the company responsible for the settlement that had defined my entire adult financial life had apparently decided, at some point in these past several months, that my death sooner rather than later served their interests better than my recovery, and had been quietly steering my own care in that direction without my knowledge. Carmen came by that same evening, and I told her about my call with Dr. Osai, watched her face tighten with an anger I hadn't seen from her before, all the more striking given how consistently gentle her presence had been throughout my time at Willowbrook. Mr. Ashby, this isn't right. This isn't just unethical. This might genuinely be illegal, insurance companies interfering with a claimant's actual medical care to minimize their own payout obligations. My aunt. Would you be willing to let me ask her about this, just to understand what your options actually are? I told her yes, grateful in a way I don't think I fully expressed in the moment, understanding that a 26-year-old hospice aide had just decided, entirely on her own initiative, to start fighting a battle that had absolutely nothing to do with her actual job responsibilities. If this story's got you leaning forward, that's exactly where you should be, because what Carmen's aunt found over the following weeks changed everything about what Highland Assurance Group actually owed me, and what they'd apparently been trying very hard to make sure I never found out. Carmen's aunt, a paralegal named Yolanda Reyes who'd spent 15 years working insurance litigation cases, met with me directly the following week, Carmen sitting in on the conversation at my request, since she'd been the one to bring all of this to light in the first place. Mr. Ashby, Yolanda explained, structured settlement agreements like yours typically include what's called a good faith claims handling provision, language requiring the insurer administering your payments to act in good faith regarding any medical care decisions that could affect your claim's status. If what your aide overheard is accurate, and if we can establish that Highland Assurance actually interfered with your care recommendations to hasten claim closure, that's a textbook bad faith insurance practices violation, and those cases typically carry significant punitive exposure for the insurer, well beyond simply honoring the original settlement terms. I remember that meeting clearly. Yolanda's careful, methodical way of walking me through exactly what evidence we'd need to build a credible case. Carmen sitting beside me the whole time, occasionally adding detail I'd forgotten from her own notes about the hallway conversation. Yolanda asked pointed questions about the timeline, about exactly when the resistance to Dr. Osai's recommended treatment had first started, about whether any other claimants at Willowbrook might have experienced similar interference, a question that sent a fresh chill through me, wondering how many other beds in that facility might be occupied by people whose care was being quietly managed toward the outcome cheapest for somebody else's balance sheet. She asked me to gather my original settlement documentation, everything from the initial 1984 agreement through every subsequent amendment or transfer of liability, including whatever records existed of Highland's assumption of the account when Corrigan Steel folded. I spent the better part of 2 days going through old files I hadn't touched in years, boxes stored in a closet that Carmen, on her own time, actually helped me sort through one weekend, patient with faded documents and my own slow, careful hands. I remember that weekend particularly, Carmen arriving on her day off with coffee and pastries, the two of us spreading 41 years of paperwork across my hospice room's small table, both of us occasionally pausing over some document that triggered a memory, Carmen asking gentle questions about pieces of my history I hadn't thought to mention in our earlier conversations. She found, tucked into one folder, an old photograph of me at 28, healthy and whole, standing proud beside the furnace station that would, 4 years later, take my leg, and I watched her study that photograph a long moment before setting it carefully aside, understanding, I think, that she was looking at a version of me she'd never had the chance to know. We found the good faith provision exactly where Yolanda had predicted, buried on page 11 of my original 1984 settlement agreement, language that had clearly been standard even then, requiring any administering party to refrain from actions that could reasonably be expected to influence the claimant's medical outcomes in a manner favorable to reducing the settlement's total payout obligation. Yolanda called 2 weeks later, after reviewing everything alongside a recorded statement Carmen had provided about what she'd overheard, her voice carrying the particular energy of an attorney who's found a case with real teeth. "Mr. Ashby, this is significant. We have a credible witness account of a direct statement from Highlands Regional Claims Director expressing clear intent to minimize your survival timeline for financial reasons, combined with documented medical evidence that your hospice care coordination has been actively discouraging a treatment protocol your own oncologist recommends. That's about as clean a bad faith case as I've seen in 15 years of this work. If we pursue this formally, we're not just talking about continuing your monthly payments, Mr. Ashby. We're talking about a bad faith damages claim that could run into 7 figures, on top of forcing Highland to immediately authorize the treatment protocol Dr. Osai's been fighting to get approved. I asked her, my voice not entirely steady, what the process would actually involve, how quickly Dr. Osai's treatment protocol might actually be authorized if we moved forward, given that every week of delay potentially cost me time I genuinely didn't have to spare. Yolanda was quiet a moment before answering, and I could hear, in that pause, a lawyer weighing honesty against reassurance. "Mr. Ashby, I'll file for an emergency injunction alongside the formal complaint, specifically demanding immediate treatment authorization regardless of how long the broader bad faith. Given the strength of what we have, I'm confident a judge grants that injunction within days, not weeks. I sat there in my hospice bed a long while after that call, thinking about a hallway conversation Carmen wasn't even supposed to overhear, about a 26-year-old aide who'd risked her own job to tell a dying man something true instead of letting him die peacefully unaware of what had actually been happening around him. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I didn't call Dennis Corbett. I want you to remember that because it matters for what comes later. I never went looking for a fight with Highland Assurance beyond simply wanting my care handled honestly. I'd spent 41 years assuming, the way you assume when a check arrives reliably every month for 4 decades, that the company behind it, whatever its flaws, was at minimum operating in good faith. I simply stopped assuming that, once a hospice aide with no stake in any of it heard otherwise through a door that wasn't quite shut all the way. I told Yolanda to proceed with the formal claim, and I told her, before we finished that conversation, something else I needed her to help me structure properly. Yolanda, whatever comes from this claim, beyond what covers my own remaining care and legal costs, I want a portion set aside separately for somebody who isn't a part. A young woman named Carmen Reyes. Yolanda didn't say anything for a second, and then, quieter, I think I understand exactly why, Mr. Ashby. She's my niece. I'm aware of what she's done these past few weeks, above and beyond anything her job asked of her. I want to fund her education, I told Yolanda. She's mentioned more than once wanting to go back to school for nursing, a real degree, not just the aide certification she currently holds, but she's told me she can't afford the time away from work to make it happen. I want that barrier gone entirely, fully separate from anything Highland ultimately owes me directly. I understand completely, Yolanda said, her voice thick with something that sounded like genuine emotion. I'll have the fund structured within the week, alongside the formal claim. I want to tell you something else about that conversation with Yolanda, because I think it matters for understanding exactly why I made the decision I did. I asked her before we hung up whether she thought I was being excessive, setting aside a portion of a settlement that had, after all, cost me a leg and 41 years of monthly payments to actually earn, for somebody who wasn't family, who I'd known only a handful of months. Yolanda was quiet a moment before she answered. Mr. Ashby, my niece told me about the day she overheard that hallway conversation. She said she stood there afterward, in the supply closet, shaking, trying to decide whether saying something to you would cost her the job she'd worked so hard to build a career around. She decided to tell you anyway, knowing full well what that risk actually meant for her own life. I don't think that's excessive at all, what you're doing for her. I think it's exactly proportionate to what she was willing to risk for a man she'd known a handful of months. I sat with that answer a long while after we hung up, thinking about Carmen's grandmother Rosa, about a facility where nobody had asked her a single question about the life she'd lived, and about a granddaughter who'd apparently decided, watching that unwitnessed ending, that she would spend her own career making sure nobody else's final months passed the same way. I understood, more fully in that moment than at any other point in this whole ordeal, that Carmen's kindness toward me hadn't been an accident of assignment or rotation. It had been the direct, deliberate result of a wound in her own family history that she'd transformed, through sheer force of will, into a purpose. I hung up the phone and sat there a long while in my hospice bed, listening to the quiet hum of the facility around me, thinking about a hallway conversation that had very nearly gone unheard, about how close I'd come to spending my final months entirely unaware that the people managing my care had apparently decided my death was worth more to them than my recovery. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. Highland, Dennis Corbett, everybody. And when they do, most of them are going to focus on the money, the way people always seem to, Once the money's the only part left that's easy to see. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are. And I think you're going to want to see how Dennis Corbett finds out, because he doesn't find out from a phone call. He finds out the way people in his position usually find out, through a formal legal notice from Yolanda's firm that lands on Highland Assurance's desk with considerably more weight behind it than he ever expected a dying man's hospice room to. I want to tell you what those 3 weeks between filing and Dennis's call actually felt like, because I think the waiting mattered as much as anything else in this story. Dr. Osai's emergency injunction came through within 4 days, exactly as Yolanda had predicted, and I began the treatment protocol the following week. A grueling but hopeful course that left me exhausted in a different way than the disease itself had. The particular exhaustion of a body actively fighting for more time, rather than simply enduring the time it had left. Carmen stayed by my side through those first difficult treatment sessions, held my hand through the worst of the side effects, brought Rosa's old recipes from home some evenings, when hospital food felt unbearable. The same quiet, steady presence she'd offered from the very beginning, now carrying an added weight of knowing exactly how close I'd come to never getting the chance to fight for this extra time at all. 3 weeks after that call with Yolanda, Dennis Corbett called me directly, his voice carrying a controlled, careful quality that told me he'd rehearsed this conversation extensively before dialing. "Mr. Ashby, I understand a formal complaint has been filed regarding some comments I made during my last visit. I want you to know those comments were taken entirely out of context, discussed in a private conversation that was never meant to reflect any actual policy." I found it strangely calm, hearing him try to walk back a sentence Carmen had written down word for word within minutes of hearing it. "There's no context, Mr. Corbett, that makes get him to expire before the quarter end sound like anything other than exactly what it sounds like." There was a long silence on the line. "I'd like to meet with you," he finally said, his voice smaller than it had been a moment before. "In person, to discuss how we can make this right." I remember sitting with that request for a full day before responding, weighing whether I actually wanted to sit across from this man again, whether hearing whatever explanation or apology he'd prepared was worth the emotional cost of revisiting that hallway conversation directly with the person who'd said it. Carmen, when I asked her opinion, told me the decision was entirely mine to make, that she'd support whatever I chose, but that she thought, if I felt strong enough for it, hearing him out in person might give me something useful, even if it was only the satisfaction of watching him understand exactly what his words had nearly cost. I decided to meet him, on my own terms, in a place that meant something to me rather than anywhere that might feel like his territory. We met 4 days later, not in some sterile Highland Assurance conference room, but at my request, in the Willowbrook Care Center's small garden courtyard, a space I'd come to treasure during my months there. The same courtyard where Carmen had wheeled me out most sunny afternoons to sit among flowers that reminded me, she'd once told me, of her grandmother's own garden. "That's where I'm going to leave this for now." Dennis Corbett arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than I'd seen him before, a small detail I noted with some interest. A man attempting to soften his own presentation for a conversation he clearly understood carried more weight than his previous visits had. He sat across from me on a garden bench, and I watched him take in the courtyard, the flower beds, the particular quiet of a hospice facility's outdoor space, with a visible discomfort that told me he'd spent considerably more of his career in conference rooms than in spaces designed for people facing the end of their lives. "Mr. Ashby," he began, "I want to start by saying I'm genuinely sorry. Not the corporate version of sorry, not the version my legal team. I've had a lot of time these past few weeks to think about what I actually said in that hallway, and I don't have a good explanation for it beyond admitting that somewhere in my career, I stopped seeing case files as actual people. I looked at him for a long moment before answering, thinking about 8 months of a care plan quietly steered away from a treatment that might have extended my life, about a hospice aide who'd risked her own position to make sure I understood what was actually happening around me. "Tell me something, Dennis," I said. "When you said that sentence, standing in that hallway, did it feel wrong to you in the moment, or did it only start feeling wrong once you understood somebody had heard it?" He was quiet a long moment, and I watched him actually consider the question rather than reaching immediately for a rehearsed answer. "Honestly, Mr. Ashby, I think it felt normal in the moment. That's the part that scares me most, looking back. I've made calls like that one for years, quietly steering claims toward faster resolution, and I'd stopped registering what those words actually meant when applied to an actual person's actual remaining time. Hearing it played back to me, in your attorney's formal complaint, was the first time in years I actually heard myself the way somebody like your aide must have heard me that afternoon. I want to believe that's genuine reflection, Dennis," I said, steady. "But I need you to understand something. Whatever internal reckoning you're having right now doesn't undo 8 months of a care plan that discouraged treatment my own oncologist recommended. It doesn't undo how close I came to spending my remaining months entirely unaware that the company managing my settlement had apparently decided my death was worth more to them than my recovery. I know," he said, quiet now, genuinely quiet in a way that felt different from corporate contrition. "I know, Mr. Ashby, and I don't have a good enough answer for why, except that somewhere in managing hundreds of these cases, I stopped being able to see any of them clearly." Carmen appeared at that point, having agreed beforehand to join us partway through the conversation, still in her work uniform, having come straight from her shift. I watched Dennis's face when he realized who she was, some understanding visibly settling into him, that the young woman sitting down beside me was the person who'd actually noticed what he'd apparently stopped being capable of noticing himself. "Dennis," I said, "this is Carmen Reyes. She's the reason I'm sitting here at all, capable of having this conversation with you, instead of having quietly followed exactly the timeline you were hoping for." Dennis looked at her for a long moment, something genuine and uncomfortable passing across his face. "Miss Reyes, I don't know what to say to you, except thank you, and I'm sorry it took a stranger overhearing a private conversation to do what my entire company should have been doing for Mr. Ashby from the beginning." Carmen regarded him steadily, the same calm, unhurried attention I'd come to recognize from months of hospice care. "Mr. Corbett, I didn't do anything special. I heard something wrong and I said something about it. It shouldn't take that for a company managing somebody's actual life and death to just do the right thing on its own." The silence that followed lasted a long moment, Dennis absorbing something in Carmen's words that seemed to land harder than anything I'd said myself, and I watched him nod slowly, some genuine shift happening behind his eyes. "I want to ask you something, Mr. Ashby," he finally said. "What happens now? With the claim, with the treatment authorization, with all of it? The treatment protocol gets authorized immediately." I told him that's not negotiable, and it should have happened. OSI first recommended it 8 months ago. The bad faith claim moves forward regardless of anything we discuss here today. That's not punitive, Dennis. That's simply the consequence of decisions your company made. What I will tell you is that I'm not interested in destroying Highland Assurance out of anger. I'm interested in making sure no other claimant in a hospice bed somewhere is having their remaining months quietly managed toward the outcome that's cheapest for your company." He nodded slowly, and I could see him understanding, I think, that I wasn't offering him easy absolution, only the possibility of genuine institutional change, earned slowly, the same way most things worth having get earned. Before he left that courtyard, Dennis asked one more question, hesitant in a way that told me he wasn't entirely sure he had the standing to ask it. "Mr. Ashby, is there anything else Highland can do beyond the financial settlement to make it?" I thought about that question for a long moment, looking out over Carmen's grandmother's flowers, thinking about 8 months of care. I'd nearly lost the ability to advocate for myself. "Yes, actually," I told him. "I want Highland Assurance to implement a formal review process for every single hospice claimant currently under a structured settlement, an independent audit to confirm none of them are experiencing the same quiet interference I was. And I want that audit conducted by somebody outside your own claims department entirely, somebody with no financial stake in how quickly any of those cases close." Dennis was quiet a moment, and then he nodded, something resolved settling into his expression. "I'll bring that to the board myself, Mr. Ashby. I'll make sure it happens." I've thought a great deal, in the weeks since that conversation, about what it actually means to be owed something by an institution legally responsible for your well-being, versus what it means to receive genuine care from somebody with no formal obligation to you at all. Highland Assurance owed me, by the clearest possible contractual terms, honest and good faith management of a settlement I'd paid for with a leg and years of pain. It took a Hospice Aide's overheard conversation and a formal legal complaint to make them honor even the most basic version of that obligation. Carmen owed me nothing. Not one single duty, written or implied, required her to write down a hallway conversation word for word, or to spend her own unpaid time helping an old man sort through 40-year-old settlement documents, or to risk her own position at Willowbrook by escalating concerns about a care plan that wasn't technically her department's responsibility to question. She did it anyway, because somewhere in her own history, watching her grandmother's final months pass largely unwitnessed, she decided that showing up fully for the people in her care is simply who she chooses to be, budget line item or not. What I know for certain is this: the institutions who owe you the most on paper aren't always the ones who show up when honoring that paper stops being convenient for their own bottom line. Sometimes the person doing the truest showing up is the one refilling your water pitcher, hearing something they were never meant to hear, and deciding, without being asked, that your remaining time is worth fighting for. Because what happened in that courtyard, with a Hospice Aide who'd fought harder for a dying man's remaining months than the company legally responsible for protecting them ever had, is a conversation that changes everything about what Highland Assurance, and everyone who ever assumed my final months would pass quietly and unnoticed, are about to understand happened here. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, right there in that courtyard, and it does not go the way Dennis Corbett walked in expecting.